I thought the small town of Osaka I grew up in was pretty nice. It had nice people, a great community, and an awesome open field where the kids of the town could play football in, or whatever sport was in season at the time. Kenny Layton's would always give me a fresh loaf of delicious smelling bread in the morning as I walked past his bakery to school. Looking back at it, he probably gave me around $300 worth total by the end of my schooling. All the buildings are small and old looking, but they were sturdy. Everything was made from brick and the foundations were solid. Folks kept their doors unlocked always, and they shared everything they could to seem as neighborly as possible. Did you happen to see the Vikings vs. Packers the other day? Whoa, what a game! Larry Anderson said with a coy smile. Knowing his small talk would get my dad's blood boiling. My dad rooted for the Vikings as we lived in Minnesota, but Larry, our neighbor, lived and breathed everything Packers. My dad would do his best to avoid Larry after Minnesota lost to Green Bay, knowing full well what was in store for him. It was fun to see my dad riled up, as he had such a calming, soothing presence. I really got to see his face get red with rage and mumbled curses to himself. The town of Osaka was a great small town until I learned about the horrors of the house on the hill. My father was a single dad, but he had tried his hardest to raise us as normally as possible. He worked in the advertisement business and loved making handmade advertisements. He didn't know how to use a computer, turning on once was even a chore, so he simply avoided them at all costs. He was old-fashioned and he liked it that way. If his hands couldn't do the job, he had no business doing what he was trying to do. My mother died when I was 6 to pneumonia. She had a really bad case of it and went downhill quickly. I can remember bits and pieces of that time. I just remember my father crying a lot and telling the doctors to not take her away yet. He kept repeating that he wanted all the time he could have with her before she had passed. I try not to bring it up with my father. I don't want to have him go back down that road again. He was a good man, and he still is. The pictures around the house are enough to remind him of her. I have caught him glancing at her pictures while he walks through the hallway. He always had a really sad look on his face. I knew he thought about her every day, and he shouldn't have to have me bring it up. I do miss my mom. I have foggy memories of her carrying me around the house pretending to steal my nose. She also pushed me around my toy cart a lot, inside and out of the house. But it was still fun to ride inside of it. Almost like I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing, but with my parents' permission. Even though I don't remember her much, I still love and miss her dearly. I was playing outside of my front yard when I remember seeing the house on the hill. It was an old wooden house, but massive in size. I would glance upon its majestic features every now and then, and when I got old enough to become overly curious, I asked my dad about it. Dad, who lives up in that big old house on the hill? It's so big it could fit the whole town inside of it. My dad shook his head and smiled. Oh, that's old man Whitten up there. He made his millions in high-priced real estate and decided to come to Osaka and build. He doesn't bother anyone. I think he just likes the peace and quiet this town has to offer. Nobody sees him much. He keeps to himself mainly, and that's fine with me. Don't bother him and he won't bother you, is my thinking about it. He patted me on my head and I shrugged it off, and I started playing with my Buzz Lightyear toy, which seemed like it was the same size as me. He even had the buttons you could push on his chest and wings that were on his back. My dad said my mother bought the toy and gave it to me before she passed, so I treasured it like it was the Holy Grail. Teddy and I were playing cops and robbers on my front lawn. Teddy was always the robber because he had a huge scar on his cheek where the dog sliced him open when he was young. Teddy asked me about the house on the hill. I told him what my dad said, and he told me that he had heard other stories. He told me some of the kids at school were saying that vampires and goblins lived up there, and if you ever saw them, they would turn you into one of them and you would live in hell forever. This scared me a little, but I trusted my dad over the mumblings of kids trying to scare others at school. We should go up there and check it out. We would be in the history books of this town, Teddy declared, holding his hands on his hips, puffing out his chest. I told him my father said that wouldn't be a good idea to bug Mr. Whitten, that he likes to keep to himself, and he made bajillions off real estate. Whatever that was. Teddy sighed and he told me to keep chasing him because he was about to rob a bank. Over the course of the next couple years, Teddy kept badgering me about the place. I repeatedly told him that I wasn't interested and that he should just go by himself if he wanted to so bad. And since he thought he was so brave and tough, he could easily do it without my wimpy little self. Teddy said he was going to venture up there after his parents went to bed and he asked if I wanted him to come and get me. I told him I enjoy my rear end not being the color of a grapefruit and not having my butt crying with pain. The next morning, my father called me downstairs to the kitchen where he was making toast and omelets. The smell of the food slithered throughout the house and the aroma was mouth-watering. Orange juice was on the table and the plates were set out. My father still set out a plate for my mother, even though he never put any food on it. It always made me so sad, but it was his way of grieving. Teddy's father called me this morning and he asked if you came around the house at all last night. Do you know anything about that? My heart dropped and my stomach felt sour. I hated lying to my dad, but I didn't want to rat out my best and only friend. I scrunched my eyebrows together and I told him that I had no idea where he could have gone and that he didn't tell me anything. My dad asked if he had ever mentioned me anything in passing and I told him he didn't, which I felt complete grief about. He let me know it was okay and he told me to eat before the Vikings game started. That night, I laid in my bed and I thought of Teddy and all the rumors about the vampires and goblins that the schoolyard bullies talked about. I tossed and turned and I couldn't help to think that he was now a vampire with blood dripping from the sides of his mouth and his teeth razor sharp. It scared me to think that it could be a possibility, but I pushed it from my mind and I told myself that those were stories to scare children, like me at night. They were only that. Stories. Teddy was never seen again and the town slowly stopped talking about him. It took a while, but life returned to normal and everyone acted like nothing ever happened. It was like he never existed. I tried to bring him up to my teachers throughout the years, but they would just smile and say it was a shame and quickly moved along. As I grew older, I became more curious, but it never developed into a fire hot enough for me to walk up to that old wooden house. I went off to college in Iowa and I came back to Osaka on the holiday break. I enjoyed seeing my father and I liked to monitor how he was holding up. I would go down for Thanksgiving and Christmas mainly, which he would fix us the typical foods for the holidays. He would still set out a third plate for my mother, which brought a tear to my eye every time. I would have to excuse myself to the bathroom to gain my composure to make sure he didn't see my sadness. I didn't feel sad about my mother. I felt sad for him. He was getting older and there was nothing more I wanted for him than to meet someone else to make him truly happy. But it was clear that he was just waiting to die and join my mother in the afterlife. The next morning after Thanksgiving I got up, packed what little I brought and I said my goodbyes. My father always told me to stay away from all the ladies falling at my feet. I laughed and exclaimed if there were any ladies. I sure as hell wouldn't trip over any. I got in my car and I stared out the window to the house on the hill. I thought of Teddy and his sudden disappearance and how the town basically forgot about him. Nobody seemed to really look too hard for Teddy. It was like they accepted he was gone and was never coming back. I saw stories of other missing kids around the nations and all the manhunts that ensued. There was nothing like that for Teddy though. Only whispers here and there. I started driving down the dirt road leading to Main Street, my eyes never leaving the house on the hill. It was like it was calling my name. A force was pulling me into the dark veil of the house. Why not check it out? Why not see who lives there? I looked at my passenger seat and I noticed a small turkey I had brought for my dad. He said he didn't want it because he already had bought a big one, so I said I would bring it back to my apartment and prepare it myself. This was my ticket to not be creepy if someone answered the door. I could tell them I wanted to introduce myself and hand over the turkey, telling them it's in the season with a fake smile. I made a left instead of the right I usually took when driving up to the house. The road leading up to the wooden house was all gravel, and the grass on each side of the gravel was slowly dying because of the changing seasons. A fog suddenly enveloped my car the closer I got to the house. I turned on my brights, hoping it would allow me the vision I needed. I didn't know if there was anything that I needed to avoid or something I could run into, so I stopped my car and I turned it off. Forgetting the turkey, I got out of my car and I started walking the rest of the way. The fog was thick and quickly wrapped around my body like it was greeting me. I didn't see the fog from my father's house, so why would it suddenly appear? I slowly kept walking, trying not to run into anything as the fog masked my path. I was certain I was getting closer. It felt like I was walking for miles. As I approached closer, I started seeing features of the house. It towered over me like a man scolding his dog. I cracked my neck and started breathing heavily. I saw the big wooden door and I took a step on the front porch. I raised my hand to knock, but the door crept open before I got the chance. I tiptoed in the entry and loudly asked if anyone was there. I yelled out that the door opened as it must not have been hinged all the way, but nobody answered. The lights were all off and it smelled like musty and moldy. I tried reaching around on the walls, but I felt no light, only the coarseness of the wood. I walked further into the darkness at which the lights popped to life. It was so bright it almost blinded me, like when someone uses a flash from a camera multiple times in your face. I looked around at the gigantic foyer I was standing in. The corners of just about everything had massive spiderwebs built intricately surrounding them. Dust coated the ground and I could see my footprints where I had stepped. It looked like this place hadn't been occupied in years. There was a single door inside the big foyer, which seemed odd to me. I was going to school to become an architect, and a design like that wasn't common. In fact, I had never heard of something like it. I walked to the door, creating footprints in my trail, and I opened it hesitantly. The new room smelled like body odor and rotten milk. The lights turned on as I walked further into the darkness, and I was brought to my knees. I looked around and the walls were covered with people. They were hung up on the walls with their mouths sewn. It looked like they had the life drained out of them. Faces and urine coated the walls underneath them. The clothes on them were drenched in sweat and they looked like rag dolls. Tubes were going into their stomach which ran inside holes built into the walls. Their eyes were all fixated on me. It looks like they all just wanted to die rather than live in this place. They were alive. There were about 50 people hung up on the walls gazing upon me. Their eyes were screaming for help, and most were in tears at my sight. I looked over to the right-hand side of the room and I noticed a woman. She looked like the woman from the pictures in my father's hallway, only a bit older and weathered. It was my mother. I quickly got up and I ran over to her. Tears streamed down her face like a river, like she could tell who I was. She was too high for me to reach. She was too high for me to reach even if I tried jumping. There was no ladder or anything for me to climb. The clamps bolted to the walls all had a key slot to them, so there must have been a key laying around for me to unlock the bindings in this house of misery. I swung my head around to the right and I saw a man, my age, trying to wiggle free. I gazed upon him closer and I noticed his cheek. It had a scar on it, just like Teddy. It was Teddy, my old friend who had disappeared. Teddy was here all along. Teddy, my mother, and God knows who else, all living in this hellhole of a place. Who put them here? I wondered that as my body began to tremble. As I tried to get my wits about me, I heard footsteps coming from the other side of the wall. The eyes of everyone suddenly began to blink rapidly like they were trying to tell me something, trying to get me to get away. This scared the ever-loving shit out of me to the point of me soiling my pants. I turned around and I quickly ran through the doors I came through and out the fog once more. I ran from my car, not caring about closing the door. A million thoughts swam through my head. Why were all those people, including my mother and Teddy, in there? How long had they been hung up on the walls with tubes running through them and their mouths sewn shut? It was clear to me that someone had abducted these people and tortured them to the brink of hell. Whose footsteps did I hear? I need to go tell my father what I had seen. I quickly got in my car and I backed out of the driveway as fast as I could through the fog. I managed to get out safely without crashing into anything, and I was on my way home. On the drive to my father's house, I felt foolish and cowardly for running. Thoughts ran through my head. Maybe I missed something. I was simply too scared when I heard those footsteps and I saw everybody start to blink. I felt like I had let everybody down who was clamped to the walls like they were simply paintings on a wall. I barged through the front door and was yelling for my father. There was a typed note on the kitchen counter which simply read, "He has come home." It was clear to me that my childhood town of Osaka was not the town it seemed to be. The house on the hill kept a dark secret that has loomed upon this town since it was built.